All right, I've got the official time of 11:31, so I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone this morning. My name is Joe Gustafson. I'm the traffic engineer for Washington County, and also the this year's chair of the Safety and Mobility Council for CTS. I'd also like to welcome our main participant in today's webinar, which is Brian Davis. Um, excuse me. Welcome to today's meeting and webinar meeting sponsored by the CTS Transportation Safety and Mobility Research Council. I'll give a little background on the council. So the CTS councils provide a forum for transportation professionals and researchers to exchange information on current transportation issues and trends. They bring together university faculty and staff with practitioners from the public and private sectors, like myself, to recommend direction and participate in improving the center's research, education, and engagement programs. And let's see. So Sam is going to share a link to the council's information in the chat momentarily. And today's webinar is Safer Stops, a new system to report school bus stop arm violations. I'll share more information about this presentation in a moment, but first I'd like to cover a few details on the webinar here. So we're looking forward to audience participation and questions, and we encourage you to use the raise hand feature of Zoom or type the word share in chat if you have a question or comment. Then we can unmute you to share verbally. Or if you prefer, you could use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to type your question or comment for the speaker. There will be audience Q&A following the presentation. A quick note about professional credits. This event meets the continuing education requirements for 1.5 professional development hours credits and 1.5 American Institute of Certified Planners, AICP, certification maintenance credits. If you need a PDH form for this, please send a chat message to all panelists with your name and email, and we will email you the form following today's event. Speaking of events, we have another event this week. It's actually tomorrow that you may be interested in. Which is the final CTS webinar for the season, which is the 2025 freight theme. And the webinar is called The Coffee Supply Chain, What Goes into Delivering Your Favorite Coffee to the Store Shelf. Information on how to register is available at the CTS website. And also coming up next Monday, on Monday, December 15th, there's a noon webinar on preparing transportation professionals for AI integration. Lastly, if we have any students joining today, could you please send a chat with your name? We do like to track the number of students who are engaging in our events. Thank you. I would also like to share that Sam Honduville and James DeSoto from CTS are also on today's webinar supporting the event, and I'd like to thank them for running all the logistics for this meeting, for setting up the Zoom meeting, for coming up with all these notes for me to follow, and for reaching out to our presenter. On that note, our webinar today is School Bus Stop Arm Violations. Um, and these violations by motorists pose a serious risk to children. A new University of Minnesota investigated the existing violation reporting ecosystem, finding issues like underreporting, underenforcing, and significant workflow inefficiencies and barriers across all stakeholder groups. To address these systemic barriers, study researchers concluded that a centralized statewide online portal is needed to streamline communication, simplify data access, and standardize reporting. They also provided near-term recommendations until this comprehensive solution could be developed. So, therefore, I am pleased to welcome today's speaker. Brian Davis is the Associate Director of the Human Factors Safety Laboratory in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Minnesota and a CTS scholar. His research focuses on the development of technologies and systems to improve transportation safety and mobility. This work includes applications such as high accuracy roadway mapping, driver assist and lane departure warning, connected vehicles and telemetry, safety data reporting, and transportation safety. Mr. Davis is also the vehicle manager for the MinCav ecosystem, overseeing all aspects of the program's connected and automated Chrysler Pacifica minivan. So, with that, I will turn it over to Brian for the presentation. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. You guys still see my screen all right?
Yes, I can.
All right, great. Yeah, so again, my name is Brian Davis. I work at the U of M in mechanical engineering. I'm in the Human Factors Safety Lab. So today I'm excited to talk a little bit about a project that we recently uh, wrapped up and published the report for, where we were looking at school bus stop arm violation reporting. And I'll get into what that means. But before I get too far, I also want to call out and thank my collaborators at the U, Nicole Morris and Will Kessler, as well as our partners at MnDOT and State Patrol, Scott Edgeworth and Mike Krakowski, and our MnDOT research representative, Dave Glyer. So what we're looking at here is, you know, what we want is to make sure that students are getting to and from school safely. And I think that's a very important but very broad goal. So one of the ways that we do that is, we look at what are the most dangerous times for this transportation process, and it's when students are getting onto and getting off of the school bus. So we have these laws in place to help mitigate these risks, looking at, motorists have to stop when the school bus is stopped with its stop arm extended and the red lights flashing. But even with that, it's a very visually conspicuous thing. Even with that, though, we see these stop arm violations occur, and they range from somewhat benign to extremely alarming, as you might imagine. We see the worst ones that bubble up into the news, and some of these are very harrowing. These are just a couple screen caps of the videos. I'll spare you the video, but we see these situations, and it's a really good reminder that at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is ensure the safety for these students when we're sending them and bringing them back from school. So how do we reduce these events? How do we mitigate the risk? How do we reduce the events? How do we hold the people you know, who do these violations? How do we hold them accountable? And there's a lot of different answers, but at the core, we really need more data. We need more information about these events. It's hard to piece together a complete story of what's going on in our state by just looking at, one or two occurrences here and there. What we really need is a better view into the issue as a whole, kind of across the state, and then that can give us a better idea of, what's going on and how do we mitigate it. So documentation, and I'll kind of loop back to this throughout the presentation, but documentation is really key for a number of reasons, not just, sending that on to law enforcement to hopefully result in citations, but also, we want to identify at-risk locations, determine the rate, kind of the scale of the problem. We want to know, like, to the extent that enforcement occurs, is that changing the relative rates, between communities, or when a law enforcement agency is conducting high visibility enforcement versus not. Um, and looking at all of these together, you know, coming at this project in the beginning, what we thought was our initial issue was, underreporting of violations by school bus drivers is the core issue. Um, and I will tell you shortly that that's not what we ended up discovering as we got into this project. But initially what we were looking at is, how do we make the reporting process easier at the very beginning? And sort of what we discovered was kind of a different story throughout the workflow. So coming into the project, what we were planning on doing was, a pretty standard, user needs assessment, looking at, what are the different needs and requirements of school bus drivers, and how do we support them to enter this data into the reporting system? Talking to school bus operators, looking at existing surveys, Minnesota State Patrol data, citation data, putting that all together, can we come up with a system that's easy for bus drivers to use? But what we ended up finding was that really isn't the problem at all. Uh, it's sort of a systemic issue. So kind of the three things that when we came into the project, what we um, ended up needing to pivot on is, there's really no set process for bus drivers or administrators to report violations to police. Um, there are sort of individual strategies between some combinations of operators and law enforcement agencies, but there's really no standardized way to handle and transmit that data. Um, so we also learned that it's extremely difficult for law enforcement to consistently receive, filter, triage, and act on these reports. It's a extremely high bandwidth operation to even just receive and triage all this information, all these violation reports, let alone actually, you know, conduct enforcement operations and issue citations. And then lastly, there's no centralized system for aggregating this data, and that's um, kind of one of the core proposals that we have after going through all of this work is um, currently there's no centralized location. Different groups are collecting different pieces of the data, but there's no single canonical source to say like these are all the reports for the state of Minnesota. So why is this the case? Why are we having these issues? You know, it's a multi-factor issue, but kind of at its core, the reporting process is very complex. It's time intensive kind of at every stage along the workflow, from the school bus operator to the school bus carrier administrators to law enforcement to depending on how far you go down, the courts and prosecutors. It's a time-consuming process to put this all together. Um, and because of that, we see under-enforcement of violations. We also see under-reporting of violations, just due to kind of overall fatigue with the system and kind of the time-intensive nature of moving the information kind of through the process. So first, kind of looping back to the data aspect, you know, we feel pretty strongly that the occurrence of bus arm violations are not being accurately reported. So doing some kind of back of the envelope calculations, you know, we have some sources of data from the annual single day survey. That's a nationwide survey that bus drivers are asked to fill out some information about just that one day, if they experienced a stop arm violation or if they didn't. And that gives us kind of a sense of what's going on, but it's very sporadic. You know, some areas are overrepresented, some areas are underrepresented, but it gives us a starting point. Um, and looking at that data and sort of extrapolating out, we would estimate that there's on the order of 500,000 violations per year um, in Minnesota. But looking at what the State Patrol knows about through their reporting system, um, which is not used by every group or every carrier, obviously, but we're only seeing, around 10,000 over the last few years combined. So this really highlights the issue that either we're drastically overestimating the occurrence of this, which we don't think is the case, or we're drastically underreporting these issues. So kind of supporting the idea that, this data is incomplete or not capturing the whole picture. When we look at these reporting rates from different communities through the systems that exist now, we would sort of expect that it would correlate with population. So, the more people in the city, the more drivers, the more students, the more school buses, we would expect that they would scale in a reasonable way. So, um, looking at population rank versus report rank. So, um, the number one biggest to the smallest and the most reports to the least reports. we really don't see any discernible pattern in the reality of the data. So we're finding that the reports are not correlated with either population or some other measures that we looked at, including population density. So, for example, the data would suggest that Shorewood or Cottage Grove have more violations than St. Paul or Minneapolis, but sort of anecdotally and just as a gut check, we wouldn't think that that's really the case in actuality, that it's really just, a function of who has the resources to collect and process these reports, versus other communities who are allocating resources other places. Um, Similarly in the data, we saw that, for example, Mankato and Eden Prairie rarely ever experience a violation, but we know that's not the case in speaking with groups from those communities. Um, Similarly to looking at population size versus reports, if we look at data from the courts to compare population size with citations, we see a similarly kind of mismatched pattern. So we would expect that population will correlate with citations, but in reality, they don't. They don't correlate with population, reporting, or injury crashes, any of these measures that we would think would kind of go hand in hand. Um, Interestingly, sort of when we look at the citation data, it seems to be, kind of a collection of very local examples. So for example, we saw that St. Paul had a lot of citations in 2016 through 2020, um, but after uh, St. Paul Public Schools ended their school resource officer program, um, we ended up not really seeing any anymore. Um, the SRO program was primarily responsible for school bus stop arm violation reporting enforcement. Um, Additionally, we see other examples like Minneapolis had fewer citations than other communities that are much smaller. For example, say Bloomington and Edina. Um, Kind of the next piece of data that we looked at, citation rank doesn't correlate with violation rank. We would expect communities with more violations would have more citations, but again, we didn't see that that was the case. Looking at these different communities, it was really sporadic. So some communities just happen to have more resources to enforce um, stop arm violations than others. It didn't really match with the um, number of reports that were coming in from those communities. So we have all this data in one sense, but in another sense, we really don't have enough data to make, concrete statements about what's happening. All the data that we have is really just showing that we need more data, which is kind of a frustrating situation to be in. So, kind of taking a step back, we wanted to look at this process and see what we could learn about it. So, um, we went to the source and we talked with bus carriers as well as law enforcement. So we talked to a number of uh, bus operators and bus carrier administrators, as well as uh, local and state police department, or sorry, local and state law enforcement, and also a couple groups from the court system. So looking at bus companies, what are the issues here? What are we looking at? What are the considerations that they have? So um, a lot of buses have camera systems on them, and that allows the driver to flag the event, but ultimately the driver still has to remember the details of the event so that they could report it later. And those kind of witness statements are really important in addition to the video data that gets captured. Administrators have to retrieve the video file from the bus. In a lot of cases, they have to physically go locate the bus, pull the hard drive, put a new hard drive in. It's really time intensive. And then they have to go through hours and hours of video on these hard drives and pull out, this is the segment where the event actually happened. So they're spending a lot of time kind of um, analyzing and processing the video data just to put together a single report for a single event. Kind of looking at the next step, the interface between the carriers and law enforcement. So in a lot of cases, it's unclear who has jurisdiction in the location where the violation occurred. So, if the violation occurs on a city street versus a county street versus a state highway, sometimes that makes a difference. Sometimes a county will handle at the sheriff's office level. Sometimes, you have to know that if your bus route crosses multiple city boundaries, when you're in this part, you're reporting to this group versus reporting to this group. So it's very complex. Um, the contact information for these different groups might be changing. So in some cases, carriers will reach out to, kind of the general line for the law enforcement agency, or sometimes they have individual people that they reach out to. But if those people leave or there's turnover, then sometimes that information gets lost. Sending the evidence can be challenging in some cases. You know, Kind of the more straightforward option where they're emailing the files or using transferring services like Dropbox or Google Drive. In one case, we learned that the bus carrier has to take the video, burn it to a DVD, and then mail the DVD to the law enforcement agency. Um, so a broad array of data transfer strategies. And then, not just looking at the enforcement piece, but the data aggregation piece. Different groups, report to their local PD, but they're not reporting to State Patrol, or they're reporting to State Patrol who doesn't do enforcement, but they don't know that they also need to report to local law enforcement. So there's a lot of moving pieces. And then kind of underpinning all of this is, once these reports get submitted, it's hard to know, what happens with that data. Is it useful? Are people using it for, citation or enforcement actions, or is the data being used? It's sort of a black hole that this information goes into, and we ask, bus operators and bus carrier administrators to just keep putting information in there, kind of on faith that this information is being used, but very rarely does the information make its way back and say, like, you know, we used your reports and we did X number of citations, or these citations were good, or these citations we felt didn't really meet the criteria, or there's it's really a one-way information stream, and sometimes that can be really frustrating for um, the groups that are creating and putting together these reports. So looking at kind of the law enforcement side, so there's kind of limitations there as well. A big one that we see kind of across the board is just the availability of resources to do these enforcement. So, there's only so much effort that can be allocated to doing any particular thing, and um, law enforcement agencies, they have to be strategic with how they're allocating their resources. Additionally, a couple specific issues that we saw pop up a couple times. So, um, if you look at the statutes, it's owner liability. So if you own a vehicle that um, is involved in a stop arm violation, you're responsible unless you can identify the actual driver. In many cases, though, law enforcement really don't want to pursue that, you know, based on internal policies or based on guidance from prosecutors or like county attorneys. They say don't really go after that unless you can identify the actual person, which is a much more challenging thing to do. In some cases, police departments they'll receive reports that they don't feel are meeting the criteria of a stop arm violation. Um, Issues with a driver who is technically committing a violation, but it's an ambiguous situation, like a road is transitioning from having a divided median to not, or the violation occurs in front of in front of the bus but not past it, things like that. Um, and then kind of looking downstream from that, additionally, we see some issues with kind of the citation process. So in some situations, the data that's provided to the violator or the alleged violator um, doesn't contain all the information that you would kind of expect it to. So, for example, in most cases, they don't send a picture of the violation like they do with red light or speed cameras. Um, in some cases, that's like a process limitation, but in some cases, they just kind of don't have the means to do that. And then additionally, in some cases, sort of the specific language of the citation can be confusing to someone who's receiving it. If the date says that it happened on this date, but they were out of town, but that's the date that the citation was issued, but not the actual event occurred. Like there's kind of some mismatched things like that that can um, cause these citations to be challenged and tie up additional resources when really, maybe the driver would have just said, yes, you got me this time. So overall, looking at all these kind of process stakeholders, what we found was, the data really indicates widespread underreporting and underenforcement, and that's sort of a core issue here. Additionally, the current reporting and communication system between bus carriers and law enforcement is it's ineffective and confusing and costly. It's resource intensive. It's sort of a many-to-many problem. A single bus carrier might need to talk to many different law enforcement agencies, and a law enforcement agency might need to work with many different bus carriers, and it's, having bespoke communication processes for each one of those pairs is kind of unsustainable at a statewide level. We estimate that thousands of hours are likely spent documenting violations that result in no enforcement or even review at the law enforcement level. That's it can be kind of demoralizing to spend all that time to put these information together, to learn that there aren't enough resources allocated to, adequately deal with all that information. And then, you know, going back to the very beginning, is improving the process for the bus driver, is that good? Yes, but we don't really think that that's going to address kind of any of these other systemic issues. So, you know, we definitely want to continue to support bus drivers. It's a very challenging task that we're asking them to do to manage the safety of the school children and operate the bus and also capture all this data all at the same time. But we want to continue to support that, but we don't think that that's really the core or only issue. So as we sift through all this data, we want to step back and say, like, what do we do? How do we fix this? What's the takeaway here? Do we just say the system is broken and move on? Or, is there stuff that we can do that, is going to improve the system kind of right away? So we put together kind of on one hand, a set of near-term recommendations, and then on the other hand, kind of this is our vision for what the future could look like with additional resources and kind of coming at this problem holistically. So first, I'll kind of go through our near-term recommendations, just looking through this reporting and violation life cycle. So for school bus drivers, one of the things that we learned that's very helpful is when they verbalize the driver description and verbalize specifics of the event in a way that the onboard video can capture that. So for buses that have video and sound recording in the bus, it's very helpful when drivers, describe the situation out loud, because that's, a very solid piece of evidence when it makes it down to the kind of enforcement piece, but also it helps them kind of when they review that video later, it helps jog their memory so that they can, fill out the form more completely and more accurately. We also recommend that drivers either keep the violation report or a notepad so that they can take down information while it's still fresh, after they experience a violation, and ensure the safety of the vehicle and the students and themselves. if they have a piece of the license plate in their head, if they could write that down really quick, that would be a good way and go a long way to kind of make sure that that information makes it down the line. And then lastly, it's just ensuring that drivers are following the proper stop procedure, including coming to a complete stop, fully activating the light system, and then um, also ensuring that there's no vehicles that are mid-pass before extending the stop arm. So one of the things that we are recommending kind of at this level is adoption of a more standardized violation report. So what we did is we created this violation report kind of after talking to all these different stakeholders that kind of standardizes the questions that are useful for school bus carriers, law enforcement, and also kind of downstream data consumers. So looking at things like a diagram of the situation so we know what side of the bus the violation occurred on, where the child was located, the direction of travel, um, a mechanism for identifying close calls or particularly egregious situations, um, as well as kind of the more standard things like the driver's name, the bus number, the route, kind of the other more basic information like time of day and location. So then looking at school bus administrators, so this is kind of the next stage. So a bus driver logs this event. What are some ways that school bus administrators can kind of improve the process for themselves? So um, we continue to recommend kind of utilizing a standardized report form, creating a unique report number that can follow the report through the workflow, um, increasing screening efforts. So in some cases, bus carriers are just kind of putting every single report into the system. And to their credit, that's something that in many cases they've been asked to do, but um, it's also helpful kind of looking at the whole system if they can provide, prioritization or some measurement of severity so that they can make sure that the really severe cases are being, looked at downstream. In some cases, there's a little bit of confusion about kind of who the report should go to. So making sure that that's kind of a well understood process by all the different people in the kind of carrier organization. A lot of carriers have really good internal processes to track reports and look at patterns, but others just sort of send the reports out and they don't really have the resources to kind of do any analysis, like looking at problematic stops or problematic types of stops or categories of common violations. And then um, one thing, and this is sort of at every level, is looking at how do we motivate more and better data is really emphasizing the value of the data, regardless of what happens downstream, is that the enforcement may or may not occur, there may or may not be a citation, but collecting the data is really key to kind of mitigate these issues at a systemic level. So the next thing is creating an online form that matches the paper form so that administrators can submit this information to State Patrol in a kind of standardized and useful way. So the goal behind this is Minnesota State Patrol, who does have a mechanism for collecting reports, although they don't act on them in a enforcement capacity typically. It's sort of the best way that we have to collect these samples across the state. So um, making sure that carriers are using the same form and the form is matched to the online form. So the paper form is matched to the online form. That's one way that can kind of reduce the burden. So you're not trying to say like, oh, the online form has this question and that sort of matches this question on the paper. That it's a one-to-one. It's an easy thing to input. Um, the next step, looking at local law enforcement agencies. So for agencies that don't have a mature system for receiving the video data, we would recommend setting up or to the extent feasible or the extent permissible, letting bus carriers integrate with their existing file share services like Dropbox or OneDrive so that they can receive the reports in um, a relatively convenient way. Um, Improving data storage for easier retrospective review. There's sort of a lot of different systems for managing the data, and you know some are really set up for data analysis and some make it kind of challenging. So working with kind of data consumers to set up a good strategy for archiving the data in a useful way. Um, we would also recommend that when the citation goes out, they include a photo of the event, similar to like automated stoplight cameras and speed enforcement. That's something that people are kind of expecting to see in many cases. And then increasing the frequency of citations processed, instead of batching them together in big chunks, doing it more regularly, so that kind of the time between when the violation occurs and when a driver receives a citation in the mail, that it's still something that they can remember having done. Looking at state patrol, our recommendations here, this is sort of getting further down the chain, but making sure to share the data back with bus companies. A lot of bus companies are collecting this data themselves and archiving it, but for those who aren't able to or aren't doing it currently, providing the data back, we think would be a good tool so they can look at it and um, you know make adjustments to stops or look for patterns in these events. Um, Refine communication that the Minnesota State Patrol doesn't pass the information on to local law enforcement, that it's purely for kind of data aggregation and analysis. That was kind of one common source of confusion. And then updating the online survey to match the paper form. Um, and then lastly, uh, so looking at the court system, so supporting law enforcement agencies to provide photo evidence sooner prior to the suspect contesting the citation. We think that would really cut down on the number of challenges or kind of the number of citations that need to make its way into the court system. Clarifying the language on the citation to avoid confusion around the date of the violation, and requesting additional resources to support the administrative demands of processing citations, um, as opposed to in some cases, just discouraging them and asking law enforcement agencies to not issue these citations. Sorry. So we went through kind of all these near-term solutions, but ultimately, we think these are good, but they're sort of on the road to this bigger solution. And our proposal is, after looking at all the data and talking with all these stakeholder groups, we think really the best solution for dealing with these issues is to create a centralized reporting system where there's only one online submission per violation. Um, the system can manage the jurisdictions, and appropriately match violations to the correct law enforcement agencies. Um, and then also kind of at the system level or at the statewide level, providing centralized and standardized reporting so that we have better data tracking, ease of reporting across multiple police departments, and systems for prioritizing and acting on kind of the most critical reports. And then also making sure that the data can flow kind of in both directions so that there's tracking kind of going backwards so that um, bus carriers can learn about, what are the results of these citations that they put together. So overall, what we want to do is streamline the workflow, um, to make the process less time consuming for everyone. Centralization and standardization makes addressing the violations easier, because people are more familiar with the data and they know what they're looking at. And then also, we want to improve feedback and data to improve kind of motivation at the reporting level and also um, kind of at the system level enable kind of wide scale data analysis. So just sort of stepping through the proposed workflow, what we envision would be a system where um, the driver's putting this data into the system. You know, the driver could either report it after the fact in an online way, like kind of at the bus barn, or fill out the paper form, in the bus or later, and then pass that on to the administrator who could input it into the system, and add in information from the video, like the video files or screen captures of the event. That information automatically gets sent on to the correct law enforcement agency based on where the violation occurred, accounting for different jurisdictions covering different parts of a single carrier's operating area. Um, at the law enforcement level, an easy way to retrieve and view the attached files, like the videos and the photos, um, a process for indicating what the disposition of that report is. So did it result in a citation, or did it not meet the criteria, or, it's a valid report, but there's just not resources at this time to address it further. And then these intended actions can be communicated backwards to the bus side so that there's sort of more information about what's happening and more visibility into the system. And then lastly, law enforcement can or court staff can put into the system what has happened. So, what is the ultimate disposition of this event? Um, did it occur in a citation, or was the citation dismissed, or sort of what happened on that side? And then record this data for later use, and notify the system of enforcement events. And that will inform sort of what happens with the data, and enables more interesting questions that we can ask of the data, like, how impactful is enforcement, or in these situations, how do we how do we answer questions that are linking up specific events with specific enforcement actions? So again, that's sort of our overall takeaway is recommending the centralized system. Um, we will note that in the final report that was looking at the statewide school bus stop arm camera grant project, we're in good company that they had a similar recommendation that the system needs a centralized mechanism for handling violation reporting. Um, this they were looking at kind of more from the camera side, but ended up with a similar um, resulting takeaway. So overall, what we did, we came up with a number of kind of near term or stopgap improvements. We want to support bus carriers, the drivers and administrators, as well as law enforcement, and help come up with some guidance for improving the system as we see it from having looked at it kind of from end to end. Um, while at the same time respecting that, there are limitations and challenges associated with all these different steps, and you know, all these different groups have a lot of different demands on their resources, and we want to be mindful of that. But looking at the system as a whole, can we reduce the amount of duplication, reduce the amount of confusion, and increase efficiency in a meaningful way. And we think that these stopgap improvements can do that. Um, Also broadening the scope of the effort to address bus arm violations. So, we're looking at kind of this piece of it, but the kind of in the broader context, the state has spent a lot of money supporting bus arm violation reporting with camera grants. We feel that based on this information and what we've learned, that camera grants alone are unlikely to increase citations, and are alone unlikely to kind of increase safety in a meaningful way. We think that allocating some of these funds to other aspects of the workflow, either at the law enforcement level for kind of special enforcement actions, or, you know, allocating resources to, you know, implement some of these changes. We think that would also be kind of a good ways to kind of support the money that they've already invested in kind of the these safety systems. And again, our big takeaway, our kind of major finding is we really feel that a centralized violation reporting system is the best way to support the needs of stakeholders. So kind of in our talks, we found that bus agencies are consistently supporting the idea of this system. You know, this is kind of a not a particularly controversial thought among bus agencies. You know, camera grant projects require or is also supporting the creation of the system. You know, in many cases, these are kind of these aren't at odds with each other. Supporting reporting, collection, and kind of these camera grants, they really go hand in hand. And supporting kind of one side of it is going to help the others to maximize the impact of the grant program. And again, putting this system together we feel would really help support, you know, from all the way from the bus operators to law enforcement, kind of every stage in the process, and ultimately, looping it back and what's our overall goal? We think having this data, being able to collect this data, um, act on it in a meaningful way, and you know, increase the safety of students riding buses is really the ultimate goal. And again, we think this is sort of a really important piece that we don't want to get kind of lost um, when we're down in the minutia. That ultimately what we're trying to do is support the safety of students going to and from school. So um, that's the presentation that I have. I would be happy to take some questions. I see that there are some questions in the chat already. I'm not sure if Joe or James, you want to facilitate that or what the best way to handle that is.
Yep, I will do that. So first, I can remind the audience to use the raise hand feature to ask questions if you'd like to ask questions verbally, or you can type your questions and comments in the Q&A box, in which case I will read the questions and comments out loud, and then Brian can respond. So I see there's two items in there already. One is kind of a comment, and the other one is a question. So the first one says, sorry, I'm doing a little window management on my screen here. Our video specialist in Rochester, whom I believe is in attendance, has worked well with local law enforcement and pushed the statute, and we are having significantly more citations, also receiving results on a regular basis, but it has been a long process. And I'll maybe turn that into a question for you. So you mentioned having to remove the hard drive from the bus in order to extract data. So would it be fair to say, based on the information you gathered, that there's not like a like a panic button type thing or something where they can essentially timestamp something to go back to? Or do these record all day, or do they kind of continuously erase unless something is flagged? And as somebody that has used a dash cam before, it seems like, once cameras got into regular consumer vehicles, they started adding these features, but because buses were maybe early adopters, maybe they didn't have those types of features developed yet. Did you come across that at all?
Yeah, so I'll sort of answer each piece of that. So um, first of all, I don't want to be disparaging on any particular group. There are a lot of groups who um, bus carriers and law enforcement agencies who are really locked in and are doing, they are doing a good job. And it's not that any group is lazy or not doing it. It's that kind of just it's a challenging problem, and in some cases we see, if there's sort of one community with one school district, one carrier, one police agency, there is a really good chance that there's, a meaningful relationship there. Um, Going to the question of the camera systems, though, sort of to the specifics of the camera systems that are deployed, there's sort of two or three main ones, but our understanding is the grant doesn't specify any particular vendor, and you know, to the benefit of kind of competition in the market, that's I think sort of why that was structured the way it was, but kind of a limitation of that is all these different systems have different strengths and weaknesses, and some are really, really streamlined. So when the bus comes back to headquarters, it automatically uploads the video into a server or the cloud or whatever. But in some cases, like I was describing, like someone has to physically go and handle it, like identify which bus it is, physically locate the bus, pull the hard drive, put it in there. Like it's a time intensive process. So there's a lot of variability. Some of these systems have kind of automated or kind of AI based detection. Um, that's sort of outside the scope of what we looked at because that's kind of a whole different can of worms that we learned about looking at what was going on in other states. But kind of suffice it to say, that there are pros and cons of those systems, but one of the benefits is it can streamline sort of identifying and chunking out these events. Um, I don't remember the other part of your question.
I think that covered all of it. Um, so there are two other comments are in the Q&A that both relate to automated enforcement. So maybe I'll wrap these together for one response. First one says in other cities they have automatic bus lane citation ticketing system. Is there a system, or do you know if we in Minnesota do that? It seems like a lot of manual processes that need to happen for this, which I assume is in reference to the current system that we're using. And then also relatedly, the other question said, was there any research into how other states are using automated citation processes similar to traffic safety camera processes? And I'm aware that within Minnesota, automated enforcement is currently not allowed, with the exception of a speed camera pilot that was just very recently approved by the legislature for City of Minneapolis and Mendota Heights. But school bus stop arm violations are maybe a little unique in that they allow video recording to be used for a citation to be issued after the fact. Do you know, uh, so to these questions, are there any automated systems that other states are using that can do this?
Yeah, so there are automated systems. Some of the vendors that bus companies in Minnesota are using have automated systems. Our understanding is that none of them are operating in an automated way in Minnesota because of these limitations around automated enforcement. So ultimately, for a citation to go out, it has to come from a police officer who has reviewed reviewed the video, reviewed the evidence, and determined that that a citation should be issued. So there there are kind of a certain number of manual steps that have to occur just due to the structure of or the framework of the statute. But systems do exist for automation. And then kind of jumping to the other question, you know, these systems have been deployed with sort of varying success in other places. A couple this sort of anecdotal evidence, but in a couple places, it seems like there's a lot of motivation for um, kind of providing grants to get these systems out there into buses, but in many cases, sort of there's a lot of edge cases and there's a long tail on sort of what the result of these systems um, kind of output. So, a system will identify a potential violation, a stop arm violation, but let's say it was incorrect. There were, I think it was a case in Florida where they had rolled out this type of system with automated enforcement, but there was no mechanism for drivers to challenge it. The courts were unprepared for this. You know, they were just saying you have to pay it or it will be late, and people that that was a understandably unsatisfying answer for people who wanted to challenge um, whether or not that event had happened or the AI had flagged it incorrectly. So, you know, this is sort of echoing the story that in Minnesota that, the cameras by themselves aren't the solution, that even with automated enforcement, there is still a certain amount of kind of support work that has to occur to make sure that you're sort of getting the most out of the system and making sure that it's applied in a fair way.
All right. That was it for the ones that were in the Q&A. I did want to ask you, you mentioned that you referred to it as a single day survey of fairly large number of bus drivers. Is that a national effort or is that something specific to the state?
Yes, so the survey is I'm not going to remember the acronym, but it's a 1 day survey by the I think it's the National Association of School Bus something pupil something. I'm really sorry, I don't, but it's uh, NASD is the common acronym. But that yeah, they have a single day survey usually in the spring, um, and sort of some groups participate and some don't. But that's sort of the best source of nationwide kind of baseline data when it comes to stop arm violation reporting.
All right. And then from the interviews that you conducted with these different groups, was there any sort of commonalities that you were seeing from that data as far as how these violations happen?
Yeah, so I think kind of the common thread is throughout all the data that we collected is there's not enough data. And maybe that's an unsatisfying answer, but the common thread that we saw is um, you know, school bus operators, carriers, they want they want their students to be safe. I think everybody wants that. They want their students to be safe. You know, law enforcement agencies, they want the citizens in their jurisdiction to be safe. It's not a kind of a lack of want, but the core issue is, you know, kind of across the board is how do we allocate resources in the most useful way? How do we make the best of kind of what these different groups have available to report this information in a way that's not, time consuming, cumbersome, confusing? Like, how do we make sure that whatever they're available to put into the system is maximized by the system, not fighting the system? So I think maybe that's kind of the commonality across all these different groups is, you know, everybody wants the same thing at a high level, but making sure that all the different parts are working together in a meaningful way is the trick.
All right. And then perhaps lastly, kind of a clarification question. You mentioned there's a state patrol form that was sometimes included, sometimes not. State patrol typically focuses only on state highways, but there must be an extra piece for them, perhaps legislatively, that's part of this. Can you clarify what that role is of what goes to state patrol versus local law enforcement and under what circumstances?
Yes, and um, so the form for a state patrol is a mechanism for reporting these events purely for data analysis. The information that goes into that system is not used for um, kind of any particular citation or enforcement action. The goal of them, or their goal is to sort of aggregate this information in a way that can start to support statewide analyses. So looking at commonalities between events and differences between jurisdictions, or you know asking these questions that kind of in a at a high level we should be able to ask of the data but aren't currently able to. So that's sort of the fledgling version of what we're proposing. But to your point, it is confusing, and in some cases it's not clear that a carrier who is reporting to their local law enforcement might assume it's going on to state patrol for reporting for these data purposes, or in some cases carriers will report to the state patrol form not knowing that it doesn't go on to local law enforcement. So um, sort of the impetus for creating one single system is, we want that to be a reality where they're putting in the information one time and it's going to everybody who needs it in a format that is convenient for them to receive it and analyze it and act on it.
Thank you for that. We did have one more question pop into the Q&A, which is maybe a good wrap-up question. Is there a timeline for implementation of the recommended process, and is there a goal?
Yeah, so oh, and I'm guessing that means buy-in from enforcement. So yeah, we I think sort of again at every stage in the workflow, groups want it to be less cumbersome. And I think um, enforcement agencies, but the ones that we talked to, they indicated that they thought this would be a good option. I think kind of the specifics of how does that get integrated into their workflows is something that probably needs a little bit more examination. But in general, I would say enforcement was on board. Um, more broadly, though, I think there's sort of buy-in in a goodwill sense, and there's sort of buy-in in a like let's open the checkbook sense, and we sort of have one but not the other. And I think identifying kind of an administrative home and a financial home for this type of system is something that's still kind of open. And um, kind of from our end, we can do these webinars and talk to the people that we talk to, um, and try to champion kind of improving the system. And um, kind of ultimately it sort of it goes on to the groups that would own it to say like this is something that's important enough that we want to allocate our limited resources to support, versus all the other things that require resources.
All right. Uh, Thank you very much for presenting. I think that was the last of the questions that we had there, but we do always save time at the end of these sessions for a round robin portion, which is independent of today's topic. And we ask the general questions, if anyone would like to speak up. What current transportation safety and mobility issues are you or your organization facing? Or two, do you have any organizational, informational, or event updates that you would like to share? Or three, what ideas do you have for potential future council meeting topics or speakers? So if anyone would like to share on any of these questions, please use the raise hand feature and you can verbally share, or you can add items using the chat to send to all participants, and I will read them, read the shared items aloud. So if anyone has anything, this would be a good time to share that. And if no one has any, don't feel bad. It's we usually don't get any takers for this segment, but also want to make sure that we offer the opportunity. So I'm not seeing any hands raised, nor any questions rolling in. So with that, I think you might get a little bit back to your day here. So I can go ahead and wrap up here. So I would like to thank Brian for speaking on this important topic today. Thanks for all the information that was illuminating on all the different steps that really go into that. It seems simple. You have a camera, you issue a ticket, but all those steps in between were interesting to learn about. So thank you very much, and I'll let everyone get back to their afternoon. Thanks.